Hello everyone, and this is BioPhoenix here, and today we're doing yet another very challenging game to review, and it's one that I've always wanted to do for a very long time, and that happens to be Tokyo Twilight Busters on PC-98. It was developed by Wolf Team and published by Telenet and was released in 1995. And Wolf Team is a developer that I've always really liked for that they put out a lot of really fascinating games, and some of them are ones that I really enjoy a lot. And this game is one that's always been a top priority for me to play one day, but as you can already imagine, yeah, this game is not easy to play without knowing Japanese. For that it is a point-and-click adventure game with a horror theme, but there were two things that were a huge help for playing through this game, and those happen to be the website Strategy Wiki has a whole guide on this game that's pretty extensive, and it was pretty easy to manage through it throughout most of the game. And another thing that was a huge help was a YouTube walkthrough from the uploader Higamaru has a whole playlist of the game, which was also very handy. So a huge thank you to these two things. And before we continue, I should also mention that there is a remake of this game on the DS that came out in 2010. It's pretty cool how a random game like this got a remake on the DS, but of course, it was also Japan only. So without further ado, let's talk about the game's story. So when the game begins, you play as a girl named Yuki, and she is stuck inside a room. And there are two Japanese guards that are holding her captive, and one of them is about to do something really bad to her, but then it turns out that some random guy breaks through the wall and saves her. And this random guy happens to be the father of the main character, Sho, who I will talk about in a moment. So this whole beginning part here is basically a tutorial level that teaches you how to play the game, and once it's over, the two characters will meet the main villain of the game, which happens to be Iron Mask, who is quite possibly the biggest edgelord of the game. So he ends up sending a monster to Sho's father and it kills him, and then he ends up kidnapping Yuki again. And then the game will shift over to chapter 1 where you get to play as the main character Sho. So he is a young boy who was studying in England, and he comes back to Tokyo, and he realizes that his father hasn't came back yet, so then he's trying to look for him, and as you know, he's dead. And once he receives news that his father is officially dead, then he gets more motivated to try to figure out who killed him. And as you can imagine, while trying to look for the one that killed him, it kind of takes him to this whole string of other situations that happen. And that is the very basics of what you need to know about the game's story. So let's go into who the other playable characters are that I haven't mentioned yet. So there is Sho's butler, Mukwin, Sayoko, who happens to be a researcher at the university that his father worked at, Gonzo, a police officer who is working on the case of his missing father, and there's Shizuka, who is a childhood friend of Sho. But there are two other characters that he does meet along the way on the adventure, such as Reika, who is from China, and then there's Hilda, who is from Germany. So these are all the playable characters that you can take on your adventure. And as always, I am not going to go into spoilers because this is a very obscure game that barely anyone that speaks English played, and I usually do encourage people to trying these games out themselves and, you know, all that kind of fun stuff. But I might go into a couple small things later, but nothing major. So now, let's talk about the game's gameplay. So as you can see, it is a point-and-click adventure game where you gotta click around the screen to make your character go to different places and examine different things and collect items and such, and you gotta use key items to get through certain doors and whatnot. So, you know, pretty typical stuff for the time. But I should mention that when you do start the game's chapter 1 as Sho, the game is gonna open up a huge map, and I will say, yes, it looks very overwhelming and very confusing. I remember the first time I got here, I was like, I'm lost. But thankfully, these two guides that I mentioned do tell you where to go. Even translating the text does a pretty decent job at telling you where to go as well. But yeah, for the most part, this whole map screen, yes, it is very confusing at first, but once you kind of know where things are, it's not too bad to navigate. But I guess I should also talk about the two different phases for the game. There is Adventure Phase and Real-Time Phase. So Adventure Phase is just going around the map and going to different locations, and the time will only go up as you go to different places. And Real-Time Phase, it usually happens within dungeons where you're walking around and the time is constantly going down, and yes, there is some time management within this game, but I'm gonna get to the time stuff a little bit later because there's a lot to say about it. So yeah, for the most part, adventure mode is the exploring around, and the real-time mode is for dungeons. But there are some chapters where you do have to do a dungeon within the first-person adventure mode, but most of them are done in the real-time mode. So for now, let's talk about the game's controls, and the controls in this game is very simple. It's just left click, right click, all mouse, nothing else. So yeah, if you know how to use a mouse on a computer, then you know how to play this game. But let me tell you a couple things that you need to know about the UI. So every character has their own separate inventory box, and you can trade items between them. And they all have 8 spaces in there. But if you do click on the word item, it actually brings you to your backpack, where you can store extra items in there. And every character has their own backpack, so don't worry, you're not just sharing one backpack, because that would have been stupid. And if you click on the bottom part of the pocket watch where it closes, that's how you pause the game. So yeah, very good that this game has a pause button for a game that has a time that's constantly ticking down. And if you click on the pocket watch itself, it will also show you what the weather is outside, which doesn't really have much to do anything, but I suppose it's a neat aesthetic. But it's pretty crazy to me that a game that takes place in 1923 happens to have a pocket watch that can not only tell time, but it can also tell you the weather. That's some insane shit. And if you hold down on the crown, the top part of the pocket watch, then the time will speed up faster. And if you click on the top part where it shows you the name of the room that you're in, that's how you can load and save your game. And thankfully, you can save your game in almost any location you want, which is very nice. Now, like I said, almost every spot, because I did notice there was like a couple spots throughout the game where I couldn't save, but for the most part though, they're very few and far between, and I don't think it's going to ruin it for anyone. But the game only has 4 save data files, which I don't think is a lot for a game like this. I think they could have given you a bit more, but hey, at least they didn't give you 1 save file like certain games do. So as you do explore around the dungeons, one important thing to know is that as your characters are constantly looking around, which plays this funny little animation, and it's especially funny when you destroy something and the character Yuki just takes out a giant hammer and starts smashing it to bits. Just really funny to me. But anyways though, yes, as you're looking around looking for items, the green bar will slowly go down, but only while you're searching. So now that you know that the green bar is like your stamina, now what is the blue bar? Well, that's your health, and you're probably wondering, what's with the health bar in the game? Do you get to fight anything? Well, yes you do. And the combat in this game was not what I was expecting, cause I had no idea what it was gonna be like, and it turns out that it's a turn-based battle system straight out of an RPG. Yeah, isn't that something? And it happens to be a first-person view style, similar to the classic stuff like Dragon Quest. But I will say, just because this game happens to have a turn-based combat system doesn't mean it's an RPG, because you don't gain EXP, you don't level up your characters, or anything like that. And there's not that many encounters throughout the whole game. And the whole point of this game is that you're not supposed to fight a whole bunch of enemies and keep grinding off of them to gain more experience and whatnot, so yeah. Pretty obvious that yes, this is not an RPG, but it happens to have some fragments of one, but it barely qualifies. But with that said, it's still pretty interesting that this game happens to have something like that. And I guess another thing I can throw in here as well that also is a bit of an odd mixture is that this game also has a little bit of a stealth element as well. For that, there's a chapter in this game where you gotta avoid a butler who keeps wandering around the mansion. You gotta like keep out of his sight. As again, I wouldn't fully qualify as a whole-on stealth game, but the fact that it has something that reminds me of one is pretty neat. Now, one more thing to talk about before we get to the whole time management thing is that there are gold coins that you can collect throughout this game, and every time you get one, it takes up an inventory space. But, thankfully, you can stack them on top of each other, and you're probably wondering, what do these gold coins do? During some chapters throughout the game, you can find a secret compartment where you can trade in these gold coins for rewards, and trust me, some of these rewards are very helpful. I won't go over all of them, but there are some really handy stuff you can get out of it, such as a flashlight, which lights up the room so you're not searching around in darkness, which takes longer to search through things, and the flashlight is unlimited, so you don't gotta worry about dealing with candles and shit, which barely last long. And then there's a magic purse, which is basically an extra inventory box, so pretty much it's like another backpack as a secondary. It's really awesome. I know there are some roguelike games that have something like that too. And then there's a healing orb, which allows you to gain up your health and stamina as it's in your inventory. And then there's also a pair of sandals that make your character run faster. So yeah, definitely some really handy stuff in there. And now we're going to be talking about everyone's favorite mechanic in a video game, the time. Now I will be honest and say that I'm still not 100% sure how the time management works in this game because both of these guides and walkthroughs didn't really go too much in detail into how it works, and from my experience playing this game, I think I have an idea of how it works, but of course, I could be wrong on certain things, so please bear with me as I'm trying to do my best here with working with what I have with such a very obscure game with not a lot of info online. So here it goes. From Chapter 1, the game starts on August 1st, and once you reach Chapter 9, which is the before last chapter, the game will fast forward all the way to August 31st. So I think you have to do all 8 chapters before August 31st, I think. Because during my whole experience playing through this game, I never got a game over from simply running out of times. Yeah, the only time I ever got a game over was just from some of the combat encounters, but yeah, for the time limit stuff, yeah, I never got a game over from that. I never just randomly died from one, which is good. So it's not like the game Darkseid, for anyone that remembers that old point and click, where that's a game where if you don't do things in the right order in a certain time, then your guy will just randomly die. And for anyone that has watched enough of my content for a while, you all know that yeah, I'm not a fan of time limits in video games, especially when they're very strict and prevent you from like going around at your leisure. But in this game, however, when I first started playing, I was stressing about the time because I just wasn't sure what was gonna happen, but as I started playing through more of the game, I realized that it actually wasn't bad, and it is pretty forgiving for, like I said, you have until August 31st to complete 8 chapters, which is more than enough time, especially when you're following these guides, and as you can tell by now, yes, this is very much a guide game. Because even if this game was fan-translated, or if you can even read Japanese, this game still manages to have a lot of moments that are tricky to figure out on your own. But as I said, as long as you follow a guide and know exactly where to go during the adventure time moments, I don't think you have too much to worry about when it comes to the whole time management of this game. So now, let's get moving on and start talking about the other things, like the graphics, and man oh man, the graphics in this game are just really awesome, I love it. So just like a lot of old PC games, I really love the UI border of this game. I just think it's just really cool and fancy looking. I really wish we had more stuff like this now. Not only is everything easy to know what they do, and it's also very interactive, but it also just looks really cool. I also really love the game's setting and atmosphere with the whole 1920s of Japan. It just looks great, and all the dark and gritty moments are really badass looking. And the game's graphics within the adventure mode stages are really beautiful looking for that. It's an actual photograph that they took, and then they defiltered it for the game's limitations, and I think it just looks really cool in this game. I can't think of too many games on the platform that have done this, but one that comes to mind was a game called Twilight. Yeah, not to be confused with the freaking books there, but no, this came out way before that. But yeah, there's not that many of them, but the few that are though, they look really cool. I also really like the game's character designs. They all fit the setting, and they all look really cool and well dressed. And there's a lot of NPC characters that don't have anything to do with the story that are also really well drawn, and yet, yeah, they just put in a lot of detail into these random NPCs, so I gotta admire that. And also some of the monster designs are really cool and creepy looking as well. So yeah, the visuals in this game, I love pretty much everything about them, but there is one minor thing I do have to mention though, and that is that, as nice as the backgrounds are in this game, there are some that they do repeat over and over for certain spots, and sometimes it gets kind of confusing to navigate, so because of that, I do think that is something that I wish we did get a little bit more of, but to be fair though, trying to make all these backgrounds and pixel art graphics is not easy, so I understand it. But I do think this game could have used a little bit more to at least make some of those later parts not as confusing to navigate. But despite that though, I love pretty much everything else about this game's graphics, but that's not a surprise if you know me well enough because I am a sucker for PC-98 graphics. And now, as for the game's music, the music in this game is also just really awesome, and I love it. And it was composed by Motoi Sakuraba, who has, done a lot of music for a lot of Wolf Team games, and yes, it is just really awesome, just like his other stuff. If I can compare this game's soundtrack to another game that he's done, was the game on the Genesis, Arcus Odyssey, and if you're familiar with that game's soundtrack, there's a lot of really great, dark, atmospheric tracks, and yeah, there's a lot of songs in this game that remind me of that a lot, but on steroids, and yeah, it is just amazing. But you also get some other really good variety as well, like whenever things are peaceful, it sounds really nice, there's a couple songs that are oddly catchy as well. Also, there is one song in this game that I thought was kind of amusing because the very beginning part of it sounds very similar to the beginning part of Hallelujah. So yeah, there's a lot of really good variety in this game, and I never got sick of the songs either, because yes, there are some that do play over and over, but I always enjoyed them every time. Also, I really love the game's opening theme, it just sounds really badass. Yeah, honestly, I really don't have any complaints with this game's soundtrack. I think it might be one of my favorite Motoi Sakuraba old-school tracks that he's done. But before we move on, I should also mention too, and I'm not entirely sure where this comes from, but there is another version of the game's soundtrack, and it happens to be a MIDI version. So yeah, you got the in-game one, which is, all like chiptune-like for PC-98 sound chip, which is great. And then you got the MIDI version, which sounds very different, but yet it still sounds very high quality, and I really like it a lot. Of course, I still prefer the chiptune version, like the in-game one, but there are some versions on the MIDI one that still sound very good. Now, if you want to go out and buy yourself a copy of this game, well, if you're looking for the PC-98 version, I couldn't find it, which is not a surprise. But when it comes to the DS version, well, the cheapest I've seen it for was $325, and there was a lot more for like $400 and $500, so yeah, just don't even worry about it. If you really want to play this game right now, you know what to do. So now, as for my overall thoughts on Tokyo Twilight Busters, is that I know for a fact this is not going to be a game that's going to appeal to everyone, and it's going to be really hard to recommend to most people, especially right now, given that it's Japan only with no fan translation whatsoever. But I can say for myself that I actually did like this game. Yeah, despite some flaws that this game does have, which I will get into, is that I enjoyed my time with this game. I was actually invested all the way through. I never got bored of it or anything like that at all. Like, yeah, I liked it. It was good. Obviously, it's not a masterpiece 10 out of 10 game, and honestly, I wasn't expecting it to being like that, and that's perfectly okay, but yeah, I liked it. So let's go through what I liked and didn't like. So when it comes to the like stuff, obviously I'm not going to repeat everything, but one thing I didn't mention earlier that is also really nice to know is that while the game is paused, you can actually still freely look through all your different characters' items and their backpack. Because you can't trade items, or you can't walk around while the game's paused, I mean, obviously. But the fact that you can go through your different characters' items in your backpack and switch between them while the game is paused is quite nice. Also, while I didn't mention too much on it for spoiler reasons, I will say that the story in this game, I actually really liked it, and I really liked most of the characters too. Like, I do think Sho is a good main character, and I do like Yuki for that she does go through a lot of bullshit and you really want her to pull through. And some of the other characters do have some interesting dialogue, which, judging from what I can tell from what was translated on my phone, I think it did turn out pretty decent sometimes. There was a couple times where it was a little bit off, but it was manageable to read. And there was some pretty interesting twists and turns during the later end of the game that some of them were pretty surprising and I liked, and then there were some that I felt were a little bit obvious, but they were still pretty interesting in their own way. For an example, our main villain, Mr. Edgelord Iron Mask, when it comes to knowing his true identity, when you're about halfway through the game, you can pretty much figure out who he really is. But even though it's not surprising, I still found that the reasons behind it though were still kinda fascinating. But as for the reason why Yuki is being targeted by these freaks though, that's something I was not sure throughout most of the game, and then once the reveal happened, yeah, I thought it was pretty cool. And I'll say it again, I am so glad that this game was not super stressful when it comes to the time management. Now as for the things that I don't like as much, and the flaws, and maybe the things I'm a little bit mixed on, so, one thing that is slightly annoying is that there are some random times where your characters will trip over, and it kind of interrupts the game. Now at first, it is kind of funny, but after a bit though, it gets pretty annoying and tedious. Like for all you people that complained about tripping and Brawl, yeah, well in this game, they have it too. Now while I do think the story in this game is really good, I will say, the very first chapter of this game is very long, and there is a lot of dialogue. Now I will say, a lot of it is very interesting, but I do think it does go on for a little bit too long. Like, I think the pacing of chapter 1 could have been done better. Also, another thing I'm going to mention, though, as again, no spoilers, is that there is one character that I'm very mixed on, and that happens to be the character Hilda, the German girl. I remember before I played this game and I've seen pictures of her, I always thought she had like a really cool design. I was like, oh yeah, like she's gonna be my favorite character whenever I do play this game. But now after playing it, her character is, very weird. So the easiest way I can put it is that her introduction is that she actually gets introduced as a villain, which I think is cool. I like that aspect of it. And as you would expect for someone to get introduced as a villain, yeah, they kinda do a bit of, some weird, uncomfortable things. And whenever that chapter is done, she joins the main gang, and at first you'd be thinking, wow, someone that does all this, like, weird shit ends up joining the team? Like, how does that make sense? Well, I won't explain that part, but I will say that she does still manage to tease the main character in weird ways, and yeah, it's just very strange and bizarre, yeah. I don't know, like I said, not really a huge fan of that aspect of her character. So yeah, that's probably the most spoiler thing I will mention. Even then, I did my best to not go into the details. And the last thing I'll mention, even though this is something I mentioned before, but I will repeat it again and say that yes, this is very much a guide game. This is a game that you will most likely need a guide to get through some parts, and using one will make your life easier while playing this game. Now for me personally, I don't mind using a guide since, you know, when it comes to playing these games for these videos, well, I kinda have to. But even if I was playing a game on my own time without worrying about making a video about it, I still don't mind using guides sometimes. It just really depends on my mood, I guess. But if you're someone that refuses to look up guides no matter what, then yeah, you're gonna have a bad time with this game. And one thing that I haven't mentioned yet, and this is something that's more of an awareness than a flaw, is the fact that this game has a lot of parts with flickering lights, and if you're sensitive to that kind of thing, yeah, you're not gonna have a good time either, because even for someone like myself, it actually did hurt my eyes a little bit. So that's all the flaws that I can think of about this game, and yeah, overall, I still like it. I still think it is a good game. Like I said, not a masterpiece, but I did find it to be pretty enjoyable. And like I keep saying, it's not a game that's going to be easy to recommend, especially right now, for that it does have a lot of things going against it that I know a lot of people have some major issues with, and I totally understand it. But as for me, a lot of the problems in this game weren't huge enough to ruin it. Like, I still had a good time with this game. And I'm finally glad that my curiosity with this game is over, and it did not lead to disappointment. Now, before we end this video, I also do want to say that, believe it or not, this is the 250th review that I've done on this channel. Like, holy shit, it's been that long? Craziness. Granted, a lot of the early stuff is not great, considering I made those when I was at the end of high school, but I never imagined myself that I'd be making 250 of these things, and yet I'm still having a really good fun time with them. Even in these weird times on YouTube, I'm still having fun. So with that being said, thanks for watching and commenting, and have yourselves a great day.
Where were you? Photographing squirrels? You're fired!
Chief, the planetarium party.
Oh, right. You're unfired. I need you. Come here. What do you know about high society?
Oh, well,
Don't answer that. My society photographer got hit in the head by a polo ball. You're all I got. Big party for an American hero. My son, the astronaut.
Could you pay me in advance?
You serious? Pay for what? Standing there? The planetarium tomorrow night, 8 o'clock. There's the door.